Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe we could wait a little bit for more people to join us. My name is Pavla Niklova. I'm the executive director of the HAVEL Foundation here in New York, and I would like to welcome you at our HAVEL conversation on Zoom. HAVEL conversations introduce international leaders, diplomats, scholars, writers, economists, and artists in the continuing debate over the most profound issues facing the global community: freedom, human rights, the state of democracy, economic policies, and global citizenship. It is my great pleasure to welcome our speakers, Salil Tripathi and Andrey Kurkov, who was awarded the HAVEL Foundation's Disturbing the Peace Prize to a Courageous Writer in Risk in 2022. We are proud to have Andrey here with us today on this very unfortunate first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let me briefly introduce our guests. Andrey is a Ukrainian novelist and essayist who lives from early childhood in Kiev and writes in Russian, Ukrainian, and English. He's the author of over 20 novels and 10 books for children. His work is currently translated into 42 languages. His books are full of Black humor, Soviet and post-Soviet reality with elements of surrealism. From 2018 to 2022, Andrey was president of PEN Ukraine. He also regularly writes articles and essays on Ukraine for The Guardian, The Financial Times, The Economist, and for other international media. He is currently a visiting scholar at Stanford University, teaching post-Soviet literature. Andrey will be in conversation with Salil Tripathi, who's an award-winning journalist and the author of 3 works of nonfiction. He has been published widely in the United States, the United Kingdom, India, Singapore, Hong Kong, and elsewhere. He's also a policy advisor on business and human rights, and has published widely on issues related to corporate accountability. Salil was born in India and is now based in New York. He's a former chair of Writers in Prison Committee at PEN International, where he serves on its international board. He's also a member of the Disturbing the Peace Award Committee. And before I give the floor to our speakers, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. And I'd like to also encourage you to send us your questions through Q&A button that is at the top of your. And those questions will be answered at the end of our discussion. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pavla, and thank you, Andrey, for making time on a very poignant and harrowing day for everyone in Ukraine and everyone who cares for Ukraine and world peace. There is a sheer audacity of it: bombing of hospitals and schools, leveling of cities, destroying a culture that seeks to assert its identity, killing tens of thousands of people, making hundreds of thousands homeless seeking refuge, the sheer assertion of power, and the idea of might being right. This aggression against Ukraine, which is illegal under international law, may seem different because it is happening in Europe, which is supposed to have left that past behind. But Europe, of course, has been a theater of conflict since the Second World War. This invasion was a brazen violation of international law, and it is a surprise only for those who hadn't been paying attention to the geopolitics of Russia's near abroad in the second decade of the century. The Soviet subjugation of its near abroad through the interventions in Hungary in 1956, the Czech Republic in 1968, in which, of course, Vaclav Havel has a stirring role, and in Poland in 1980 are vivid. And then there is a war that tore apart Yugoslavia. Ukraine has been pluckily and valiantly fighting with some international support. We can always do more, but so distorted and cynical has political discourse become today that yesterday, even a vote calling for just and lasting peace under UN Charter at the UN saw 7 countries oppose the resolution and 32 countries abstaining it. 141 voted for it. It was an overwhelming victory, but it was still an issue in which 32 countries could not make up their mind. We are entering into that kind of penumbra terrain there. Watching this country, his own country, getting torn apart is my friend Andrey Kurkov, who I've now met in Europe, in US, in UK, and in India over the past few years. Andrey is a writer and thinker from Ukraine who has been awarded the Disturbing the Peace Prize at the Havel Library Foundation last year in recognition of his courage, leadership, and writing. The prize is given to an author who personifies the idea of speaking truth to power. And that Andrey has been doing it, and as Pavla pointed out, not only through his writing of nonfiction, but also through satire and Black humor. He has been active in the past year, traveling overseas, speaking out, writing in international publications, attending literature festivals, and keeping the idea of the Ukrainian nationalism and freedom and resistance alive. His books are too many to mention, but they are funny, they are poignant, and they are real, and they speak a different kind of truth. And I do recommend that people will read them, those who haven't read it. First of all, thank you, Andrey, for joining us on this today. I suppose my first question is the inevitable one. At a personal level, what has been the last year for you? How has it been? Is your family safe? Are your friends safe?
Well, it's a very wide question to answer. We were with my wife in Kyiv on the first day of the war, and we were woken up by explosions outside our windows at 5 o'clock in the morning. There were 2 more explosions at 6 o'clock, and then we left our apartment block to look for a bomb shelter. And we stayed 1 more day in Kyiv. But our children at the beginning of the war were in other Ukrainian city on holiday in Lviv with their friends. So then we traveled to find them, to take them to the Western Ukraine, to the border region of Transcarpathia. And since then, actually, we were based for 5 months with my wife and older son in Uzhgorod, a small, nice town with a large part of Ukrainian Hungarians living there. And actually, there were several languages spoken all the time on the streets, which is for me an ideal Ukraine, because Ukraine is a multicultural country. I am one of Russian speakers, but there are Crimean Tatar speakers, Polish speakers, Romanian speakers, etc. It's a very big, large, beautiful, very interesting country to live in and to study, to discover. But I mean, the war is not the best time, of course, to discover, but this is exactly actually what happened. Because of the war, many people around the world are discovering Ukraine, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history, and Ukrainian mentality. Now I can say that we are already for more than 1 month with my wife in Palo Alto in California, where I'm teaching at Stanford. And I'm still writing articles and essays about what is happening in Ukraine. I'm in touch of course, with my children who are in Kyiv, with my cousins and their families, with my brother, with many friends in different parts of Ukraine. And thanks to today's technology, I'm in touch with my colleagues who became soldiers and who are actually fighting on the front, like Artem Chekh and Artem Chepai and Markian Kamish and many others. And they have time to fight and to write and to send their texts to international media. I mean, the life changed drastically in the last year. I haven't written 1 line of my prose. My latest novel remains unfinished from the 24th of February. But I would say that actually also when you are away from Ukraine, away from your country, you are sometimes more worried about what is happening there than people who are there, even if they are much more close to the front lines and to the war zone. But somehow it becomes routine. It becomes routine to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to check the news from Ukraine, and then to write messages to people you want to check that they are fine, they're alive, and wait for their replies. It is routine to check how many soldiers were killed or what were the successes or losses on the front line. And I hope this routine will be over. I mean, I think everybody among Ukrainians is tired of this routine because, I mean, the routine of the war is becoming daily routine and replacing the normal routine of daily life.
Now, in that kind of a context, I just want to go back to what you said. I had a question about writing fiction, and you said you've not been able to go back to fiction and work on your novel again. Is that because it was about a theme that seems irrelevant now? Or is it because the journalism and commentary that you do is far more urgent?
Well, the journalism, essays, and commentaries were very urgent in the first 7 months of the war, when there was obviously lack of information about Ukraine, backgrounds of this war, reasons behind the Russian aggression, etc. It seems that in the first 7 months, almost everything which could be told about Ukraine was told, but still you have to fill this space that exists now in the information world for Ukrainian information, for Ukraine. So, of course, I mean, I think until today, non-fiction essays, historical texts are more relevant than fiction. But at the same time, some of my colleagues continue to write fiction or restarted writing fiction. And I think they also have a reason to do this because you cannot have a break in the development of culture. And the culture, I mean, this war is also against culture. Not only because more than 500 cultural buildings, museums, conservatories, philharmonic universities, schools were destroyed by Russian aggression, but because actually Russian occupiers are now destroying books taken out of Mariupol library, or they are destroying in some places in like Luhansk, so-called Popular Republic, People's Republic. They issued a list of banned books that should be removed from the libraries and destroyed and not allowed in. Among actually these books, one of mine, at least one, the Diary of Invasion, which was just published in Ukrainian recently. So I mean, while the war is going on also on the cultural front against Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity, I mean, Ukrainian people of culture should defend Ukrainian culture, should develop it, should resist. And in this sense, I would say that Ukrainian poets are much more active and much more in demand in Ukraine than Ukrainian prosa authors, because I mean, prosa requires quiet time, concentration. You cannot concentrate when you are hearing air raid alerts or explosions, or you want to watch the news, or you want to watch the Messenger, Telegram, or YouTube videos that are recorded from the front line. So, and I'm very happy that actually Ukrainian poets are now so active, and they are traveling all around Ukraine and outside. And in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, even when Kharkiv was much more heavily bombed than today, people were coming to the shelters to listen to the poetry and to be saved from the bombing. And actually, the first literary big events were taking places in bomb shelters and in metro underground. Since then, actually, I mean, the culture returned to the surface of Ukraine. And the poetry which is written now is very charged with not only with resistance, but I mean, with spirit, with energy. So, I mean, people need this sort of being recharged emotionally because it's not true to say that everybody is defined and 100% optimistic in Ukraine. It's difficult to be, I mean, it's difficult to be optimistic. It's easier to be defined, but a lot of people are tired emotionally. They are worn out. I mean, they lost their friends, relatives, husbands. And I mean, now I think every Ukrainian has somebody who is killed on the front lines or under the shelling. I mean, among my friends, I have several people whom I will never meet again, and this is very painful. I mean, it's difficult to remain optimistic in this situation, but poetry does it. Prose will work after the war. I mean, prose is the sphere, the space to analyze, to recall, to remember, to fix, and actually, I mean, the further authors are now writing, like me, more non-fiction.
Yes. In fact, I was just going to, when you mentioned memory and attacks on cultural civilization, that's what came to my mind. And I was going to ask you that question. And maybe this is the time to tackle it, which is the attack on memory and an identity, which is at the root of this conflict about a large culture thinking that it owns and therefore it must subjugate something that is distinct and different, but which it doesn't want. Can you just elaborate a bit more on that, of the kind of attacks, the cultural attacks that have taken place? Because just this morning, I received the email from PEN Ukraine, as they do every week. They send out the missive, and they've itemized the sheer number of cultural institutions that are attacked, and it's horrifying.
Well, a list is huge. I mean, of course, I mean, we shouldn't forget that today there are more than 87,000 war crimes committed by Russian army that are fixed, that are recorded, and of course, and there are lots of crimes against culture, and I cannot ignore also the fact that more than 30 writers and poets and publishers are killed in this war, and some of them were executed, like Volodymyr Vakulenko, an author of children's books who published 13 books for children, who was twice taken for interrogation in Kharkiv region near the town of Izum. He remained in the occupation because of his ill autistic son and because of his old parents. And second time he didn't come from the interrogation in the early March, and his body was identified only in the autumn last year. And 2 bullets from the handgun Makarov were extracted from his body, which means actually he was killed by either FSB officer or by officer, because soldiers don't have handguns, they have machine guns. And I mean, and he was a Ukrainian activist, and this is why he was killed. So in this sense, what I want to say that Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian literature was unknown to the world before the war, because many people in Europe and outside Europe were thinking that from the territory of ex-Soviet Union, there was only Russian literature that was coming and that was great and worthy attention. When I was talking about Ukrainian literature in France, in Germany, people realized that actually they don't have translations, or not of contemporary writers, but of classical Ukrainian literature, which means that they didn't believe that there was classical Ukrainian literature. So it was not only Ukrainian classical culture that was ignored all these years. The same I can say about Belarusian, Moldovan culture, cultures of Central Asian states like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, etc. So now, when people realize it, they pay more attention to everything which is and was existing on this territory apart from the Russian literature. And I read this morning on Facebook a post by a Russian young writer, Alexander Snegirov, whom I met many years ago. And it's interesting that I mean, he wrote that the greatness, so-called greatness of Russian literature, of Russia, of Russian culture is one of the causes of this war. Because, I mean, when you think that you are great, you look down at everything around you, and then you feel that you can actually not only ignore, you can destroy what you think is distracting attention from your greatness. And
yeah,
this
and
is
there is
what's
hubris,
happening.
and that arrogance leads to hubris, and after that comes the fall, and which is the tragedy of Russia.
Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you spoke about the emotions that you have gone through, and it has been a roller coaster ride. You spoke about defiance. You must have felt depressed. You were angry. you're crying out for justice, but you also have satire inside you. So can you walk through some of the feelings you felt over the past year and how it has manifested itself? And are you going back to writing fiction anytime soon?
You know, I tried 2 times in the wartime to return to fiction. I failed. And it's interesting. First time I failed because of the feeling of guilt, because suddenly I thought that, well, I mean, how is it possible? In fiction is entertainment. Even if it is intellectual fiction, then it is intellectual entertainment. And this word that, I mean, is not in harmony with the war. Is not in harmony with the blood, with tragedy. And although I was writing actually the novels, the third novel about 1919, about the civil war time in Kiev, when Kiev was occupied by Bolsheviks for the second time in 1919. I will try again. I will try again in March to get back to the novel that I interrupted, because I think it is important. History is important.
Yeah.
I mean, what is incredible? I mean, now the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, are asking from the front lines to be sent books on Ukrainian history.
Right.
Because suddenly they understand that they need to know more about their own country that they are fighting for. And this is also a sign of strengthening of their identity. Identity is a cultural phenomenon. It is made of language, history, and culture. And so in this sense, I mean, my last 3 novels, 2 finished and 1 unfinished, about 1919, they are also are destined to become part of identity. Although I'm a Russian speaker, I am ethnic Russian, as several millions of Ukrainians. But as I said in the beginning, Ukraine is multicultural, and Ukrainian identity can be made of Russian language, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture, or Moldovan language, Ukrainian history. The fact is that most of the Ukrainians understand Ukrainian, and there are more and more people are speaking Ukrainian, and of course there are more and more poets and writers, especially young ones, who are switching from Russian language into Ukrainian. And in this sense, still history, including history of national minorities and what was happening in Bessarabia, what was happening with the Pontian Greeks, will be of big importance in Ukraine, because maybe not many people know that the first victims, civil victims of this war, were ethnic Russians and Pontian Greeks in Mariupol. So the narrative of Putin that he is coming to defend Russian speakers like me is a complete lie, because I mean, the Russian army came and first of all killed thousands and thousands of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine. And this is also to be talked about.
Yeah, and this inability to understand what aspect of a culture does a person identify with. Is it the language, is it the religion, or is it the ethnicity? Is a profound one, because, you know, the world is full of examples like that. I mean, I wrote a book on Bangladesh, and, you know, where the nationalism was initially supposed to be about Islam. You had West Pakistan and East Pakistan, but which failed to recognize the subtlety about the fact that there was a Bengali nationalism, which was a different idea that asserted itself and led to the creation of the country. Language can be a very powerful and potential source. Absolutely.
Well, in Ukraine, the situation is more different than in other countries, because I mean, what unites Ukraine is Ukrainian mentality.
Right.
And you can be a Russian speaker, you can be Hungarian speaker in Western Ukraine, but if you are the sort of proprietor of Ukrainian mentality, you are Ukrainian. And what is this mentality? The main difference between Russian and Ukrainian mentality, that for Ukrainians, freedom is more important than stability. For Russians, stability is more important than freedom. Why is it so? Because Ukraine never had a royal family. Right. I'm not talking about small kingdoms in the 15th century, but from the times of Cossacks, from 16th, 17th century, Ukrainians were choosing their leaders. They were elected at their rally. by other Cossacks, together with the higher officers and judges. And then they were replaced by the same Cossacks. So Ukrainians are used to influence their political life, their social life. They are used to be able to change the direction of the politics. I mean, this is why Ukrainians actually protested en masse in 2004 against falsifications in the presidential elections, which never happened in Russia. And so, I mean, in Ukraine, civil society, because of this mentality, is much stronger than political elite. Political elite is afraid of the street protests. The protests of 2013-14, when ex-president Yanukovych tried to sell Ukraine to Russia for $15 billion credit, $15 billion credit. I mean, he had to flee the country. He found refuge in Russia. And this was the beginning, actually, of this war. We are talking today, of course, not about first anniversary. It is 9th anniversary of the war, because the war started with annexation of Crimea. And if the world reacted to this annexation, we wouldn't have this year today, this new anniversary. But never mind. But I mean, what I want to say that Ukrainians do not give up on their freedoms. And they are prepared to fight to the bitter end, because if the country is occupied, half of Ukraine will go to the other countries where the freedom is respected, and nobody wants it. Nobody wants Ukraine to become part of Russian Federation.
The next question I have is about the role of the writer, because you did say that, you know, writing fictions, you almost felt there's an element of guilt, as it is a luxury. So is the writer's role at a time like this to be a witness, to be a recorder, to be a chronicler, or should the writer actually take up weapons? As you mentioned, 3 writers who have done. I was going to bring up the case of Oleg Sentsov, who also, you know, joined the military. So I'm just curious, that is there a more open form of defense and activism that, I mean, you're not in the country, so you're not in the same situation, but if you are a Ukrainian writer, how do you resist?
Well, I mean, Ukrainian writer is Ukrainian citizen.
Right.
Not necessarily in the sense that he possesses Ukrainian passport, because I mean there are Ukrainian writers with American passports living in New York, for example, etc., who take part, who volunteer, who send money, who organize humanitarian aid, etc. But I mean, Ukrainian writers became much more politicized starting from 2004. I should say that actually from 1991, from the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian writing community had a certain allergy against social and political issues, because they associated for them with the communist past, because they were thinking that actually being political meant to serve the system. I mean, we don't have a system since 1991. We have a government, we have elections. During Putin's reign, we had 5 presidents, while they had only 1 Tsar. So in this sense, Ukrainian writers are engaged now in all the processes that are extremely important to save and to defend Ukraine. And many of them volunteered to the front lines, actually volunteered even in 2014 when Donbass was attacked, like Boris Gumenyuk, a poet. And we are talking about dozens and dozens of them. Those who are not taking part in the combat, I mean, they are traveling in the war zone. They are writing witness accounts. That's true. I mean, from the very beginning of this new offensive, we talked in PEN Ukraine and outside PEN about necessity to fix all the crimes, to fix everything, every destiny which is destroyed by Russian aggression. To work with refugees, to record the witness accounts of refugees and of displaced persons. I should say that majority of Ukrainian writers had their own experience of being displaced persons or refugees. I mean, I had, my family had. At the same time, for example, my youngest son returned to Kyiv in the beginning of March after we settled in Western Ukraine. And he is not a writer, but I mean, he he has this experience, he will carry it all his life. He will share it.
Right.
And this is probably as important, if not more important, than actually fighting on the front line. Because, I mean, the bullets you shoot, they have a short life. They have a very short flight. The witness accounts, the chronicles, the texts, they remain.
Absolutely.
They become bulk of the documents that will describe the authentic today's situation in Ukraine for the generations to come.
Yeah. You know, I want to take us back to the only time I was in Ukraine, which was in Lviv for the PEN Congress in 2016. And one of the things that struck me at that time were these posters, and you would of course remember them, 2 + 2 = 4. And the reason it was put as 2 + 2 = 4 was that was a hard truth. And it was truth that was under assault from the Russian propaganda that was coming. And to fight that propaganda seemed such an urgent thing. Everybody didn't appreciate that at that time, but now, of course, those who did not have realized better. And this takes me back to the role that social media played in the conflict, you know, in terms of rewriting and altering history. And way back in 1710, it was that Jonathan Swift had written that falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. You know, we have often said that, you know, while the truth is tying its shoelaces, lies are 10 miles ahead already. So in that kind of a context, how do you confront lies? Is it by blocking off voices that are lies? Who decides what's a lie? Who decides where the truth resides? Truth is always a casualty in a war. And after all, Havel was talking about living the truth. So how do we square this circle of, you know, falsehood on one side, which you have to resist, and at the same time, we remain committed to freedom of expression?
Well, it's a very difficult question. It's a very difficult task. I mean, you require human resources and financial resources and technological resources to trace the sources of life, to see the difference between people who disagree and people who don't exist, but they are sort of fake images, are spreading lies and false narratives. I think it's easier to fight on the cyber front when you can see that these 50,000 Facebook accounts are not real. They are set up to spread lies. I mean, this is easy if you have these resources and access to this technology. If you don't, and you are just a user, an account holder, and you start following the false accounts, non-existent people, you become an instrument in this war, an instrument in the fight against the truth. I'm following what is happening in Latin America, where the Russian narrative is very strong and where there are lots of people with anti-American sentiments, and they pick up on this. I mean, they think that, well, they found the sources of information which coincide with their political attitude and their political views, and they spread these lies, and they believe in Russian narrative. And it's very difficult to fight against Russian narrative in this situation, because, I mean, you don't want to create, just like Russians, 100,000 fake accounts and spread anti-propaganda, because in this situation, even if you are spreading truth, it can be perceived as lies because of the technical instruments you are using. So I mean, the main issue is education here. Education, self-education, and keeping people informed. Keeping people informed without using propaganda, without giving them doubts or reasons for doubts that what you are saying is not true.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right about putting your finger on the pulse of technology, because technology does enable the distortion of history. Technology is value neutral. It doesn't know what is good or bad or truth or falsehood. It's the people who are writing it and creating it, who recreate this fiction around it, who are responsible. I still remember, again, when we were all in Lviv, David Patrikarakos was talking about his book, which was called War in 140 Characters. And he was basically looking at the factories of falsehoods that were coming from Russia at that time. Now, we know, if we take the situation outside Ukraine, you know, whether we look at Sri Lanka or Myanmar, the role of social media companies in disseminating misinformation and disinformation has come under great scrutiny. And people now want to have some kind of a legislation to combat it. People want to have criminalization of, and this of course can be a double-edged sword, because it means giving power to the state to determine what is and what is not the truth. So how does a writer navigate that? How do we recognize that something is falsehood and something is truth, but technology makes it go much faster? How do we confront that? How do we challenge that? Do we again go back? I go back to the Havel question. Do we live the truth and hope that that will deal with it?
Well, I mean, we lived without technology for centuries.
Yeah.
And then actually any revolt, any revolution was caused by the real events, real hardships, or these public disagreements without technology. Now you have a choice. You can ban Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook like they are banned in Russia, and leave only Russian control messengers, which means that if they are state controlled, that they can disseminate the false information, etc. But I think actually people who run these messengers, they are responsible for the analysis and I would say the sort of critical approach to their own accounts. They should be able to see who is misusing their messengers and their technical capabilities, and they should be controlling it. Because I mean, if you give it this control to the state will misuse this. Any control is misused by state, independently from the level of democracy in this country. So I don't know how to do it through legislation, but at the same time, I'm against any kind of blocking the messengers altogether. But I believe that there is a possibility of technological control and of just closing down non-existent fake accounts. Or, I mean, Twitter is doing something like this, and there are the messages which are warning you that this source of information is controlled by the government or associated with government or with this group. But it should be done, I think, on a much more serious level.
Yeah, it needs to be done much more systematic. That's certainly true. There is a role of, you can build a highway, but you also have to establish traffic rules, and there have to be policemen on the highway. Otherwise, there'll be mayhem and chaos and accidents. I mean, that's the analogy I would think of in this context. I want to go back to the role of writers and fiction. You said that sometimes you felt because novels are entertainment, it might seem like luxury. Is reading novels at this time also a bit of an indulgence? And parallel to that is a question, how do we read Russian literature now? Is this not the time to read Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and discover other writers? How do we address the issue of cultural boycotts?
Well, I mean, cultural boycott, of course, contradicts principles of personal freedom. So, I mean, if you are in love with Pushkin, you can ignore instrumentalization of Pushkin in this war. Because, I mean, Pushkin was made a soldier in Russian army by Putin, as well as the librarians in Russia were made soldiers. In the beginning of the war, the libraries in Russia received a letter from the Ministry of Culture. They were told to organize activities and projects to support Russian army. And some libraries, like in Bashkiria, in the autonomous Russian Republic, they were using monument to Pushkin to support Russian army. And when Russian army occupied Kherson region, they put up billboards with Pushkin portrait and his quotation about his love for this part of Russian imperial territory. So, I mean, you have to understand why the reaction towards Russian literature in Ukraine is so negative now, apart from the fact that actually Russia was marking territory of Russian Empire with the figures of Russian culture. I mean, Ukraine had more than 800 Pushkin streets in the towns, cities, and villages, and almost no streets named after Ukrainian writers. So it was to mark that Ukraine was part of Russian cultural territory, as well as Ukraine was until recently part of Russian book market, not a Ukrainian book market. So, I mean, what Ukraine is doing now, Ukraine is freeing its territory of enemy culture, and after the war, sometime after, Russian literature will return to Ukraine as a part of world literature, not as a part of Ukrainian literature.
Right.
But at the same time, I mean, I should say that you can buy books by Russian writers, classical and modern, in Ukrainian bookshops today. Not in all of them, but definitely in major bookshop chains, you will find everything. There is no censorship, although from 2014, some books were stopped at the border. The books with anti-Ukrainian propaganda, or the books which were, it's in a very interesting way camouflaged. I mean, like, for example, Bulgakov's edition with foreword from Surkov, from the second man in administration of Putin. So it was actually banned not because of Bulgakov, but because of the preface.
Yes.
And at the same time, the same books by Bulgakov were published in Ukraine. So nobody was banning Bulgakov or other writers because of the content of their books.
Right.
I mean, we have, it's a separate issue. We have a discussion about Bulgakov's legacy because first part of his life he spent in Kiev, and one of his major novels, The White Guard, shows his attitude towards Ukrainian nationalists and during the Civil War. But I mean, but I don't think we should judge Bulgakov on this today.
Absolutely. And I think this whole idea of separating the writer's views from the views expressed by the character of in the book is also a very crucial part. And, you know, and it applies to all literature. It's not specific to Ukrainian or Russian literature, but you know what characters is.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to answer another question, whether it is time for reading now in Ukraine.
Yes.
Actually, I mean, yes, we have a crisis in publishing industry. What we have to in 2022, there were only half of the books sold that were sold in 2021, but publishers resumed their activities, and they are publishing now unknown classical Ukrainian literature, unknown to Ukrainians. They are publishing the works of Ukrainian writers of 1920s and 30s who were exterminated by Stalin in Gulag. And it's interesting. I mean, these books are in demand, just like books on Ukrainian history. So, I mean, Ukrainians are catching up culturally on their own literature, on their own history. And these books are read now more than the books by contemporary Ukrainian authors. I think contemporary Ukrainian authors like me can wait, because I mean, I don't want to distract people from the war, because I know that the psychological sort of connection between every person and his country is now at stake. And although, I mean, people want to be distracted, people go to theaters. I mean, the theater performances are sold out usually in Ukraine. But again, I mean, plays, theater is like poetry. I mean, you go there to be recharged.
Right.
The book takes your energy, your thoughts. It distracts you sort of on a deeper level, which is maybe, I mean, it's okay when you are distracted by something that enriches your understanding of your country. But still, I think actually entertainment probably is not the best reading now for Ukrainians.
Right. Yeah. Another question, which is a complicated one, but we all want an answer to that question. How do we support dissident writers in Russia today? Those who are bravely standing up to what's being done in their name by their country. How can the international community of writers express solidarity with them?
Well, there are not so many of them, so it's very easy to define them. And I think they should not be ignored. They should be supported. I mean, writers like Vladimir Sorokin, Mikhail Shishkin, who are outspoken against the war, against Putin,
Yeah.
who had to go abroad, settle abroad.
I had Shishkin in my mind, indeed, yes.
Yes, I think they should be supported. And I mean, they were warning, actually, they were warning us and Russians, their readers, 20 years ago, what can happen. So, I mean, for me, they are not responsible for this war. And I mean, to say that there are no good Russians is minimum is silly, because I mean, we hear the voices. We don't hear many voices. We don't hear choir or chorus of the voices against Putin. But what we hear, actually, the voices of culture. We don't hear the voices of politicians who are opposed to Putin en masse and who are ready actually to fight with this regime and to change it, yes. But every separate voice against Putin among the cultural community should be valued and should be heard.
Right. One final question before we turn to questions if they've come in the chat. I have not looked at the chat yet, but perhaps you can respond while I'll start looking at that. And that I want to bring back Vaclav Havel here to the conversation, you know, and disturbing the Peace Prize, which you so rightly won last year. What would Havel say today about this conflict, and how does he inspire you?
Well, I mean, he was a person of truth. And he gave lots of definitions of truth, and actually he was talking about truth and justice a lot. And for me, he's the only example of a man of culture turned into a politician, and who retained all his human qualities, who had the same principles as a writer, as a playwright, and as a politician, and who managed to bring harmony into the Czechoslovakian society, first of all in Czech society. So I think his legacy is something that defines today's politics and a level of morality in the Czech society. So I wish actually we spoke more often about him in Ukraine. Yes. But of course, I mean, I think Ukraine is very different and much more complicated country because of its size and because of difference between different regions and its history. But I think Václav Havel will remain as an example of ideal president also for Ukrainians. And I heard very often during discussions between politicians and intellectuals in Ukraine that Ukraine would love to have a president like him.
Many countries would love to have a philosophical president like Havel. That I'm quite sure of, absolutely. Pavla, do we have questions?
Unfortunately, I don't see any, so I'd like to encourage our audience. One of my questions, I don't know if that should be at the very end, would be for Andrey. How do you envision future relations between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I don't think Ukrainians want any relationship with Russia in the next 20 years, and definitely in the first years after the war. And this means that actually in the imagination of Ukrainians, they want to have an iron wall between Russia and Ukraine, the wall against which actually everybody probably would stand up in Europe. But this is actually the question of security of Ukraine. People believe that even if the war is finished with some kind of agreement with Russia, Russia will attack again. Russia will not give up. And still, I mean, if trying to be on the optimistic side, I remember that when I was 12 years old and I was given a choice to learn either English or German in the school, I said that I will never learn German because Germans killed my grandfather in 1943 when he was actually liberating with the Soviet army Kharkiv, Ukrainian Kharkiv, from German Nazis. And then when I was 37, I was asked to learn German by my Swiss German publisher, and I learned German. I speak German today, and I don't feel today's Germans, I don't hold today's Germans responsible for the war, for the atrocities of the Second World War. I hope it will happen also with Russia, but for that, Russia has to change drastically. So today's Russia should be shunned and should be considered even by Russians in the future, the society which committed war crimes en masse and atrocities against their neighbors. And I'm talking not only about Ukraine, I'm talking about invasion of Russia into Georgia in 2008, and then the atrocities in Moldova, as a result of which so-called Republic of Transnistria was formed, where even today we expect problems. So in 30 years' time, in 40 years' time, there will be another generation of Russians coming into the active stage. And I hope Russia in 20, 30 years' time will have civil society, which they don't have now. They will have middle class with political attitude and not only with business-oriented attitude. I hope that they will understand that freedom is more important than money and stability, because freedom makes you somebody who decides your own destiny and who can influence the politics in your own country.
I see there is a question here. Okay. Hello, Andrey. This is from Theo, Alec and Theo. In regard to the pro-occupation flyers and billboards that you mentioned, do you have any feedback on how the librarians and the general population changed the course in promoting their feelings as a war and impact on civilians dragged on? It's from Vera.
Is it about Russian literature in Ukraine?
It's about the librarians in Moscow. I think that's the question, who were, imposing a particular. Am I right, Vera? I mean, you can type in here and tell us if I interpreted it right.
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Yeah, I'll repeat it again. In regards to the pro-occupation flyers, billboards that you mentioned, do you have any feedback on how the librarians and the general population changed course in promoting their feelings as a war and the impact on civilians dragged on?
Okay, so it's about Russian territory and Russian campaign to support Russian army. I mean, it's going on. It's going on now, even to the higher extent. I don't know about new projects by librarians, but actual librarians were very active, and they were even organizing car rallies to support Russian army. What is happening now? I mean, officially we know that 85% from the Russian official sources, 85% of Russians support the war. From unofficial or from Levada, for example, independent sociological center, we can see that about 76% of Russians are in favor of the war or more likely to be in favor of the war. So Russian society is standing by Putin. What I wanted to mention that the children in Russian schools were asked to write letters to Russian soldiers on the Ukrainian territory. But recently, also Ukrainian children on occupied territories in the schools were asked to write letters in support of the Russian army. So all this is going on. I cannot give you any positive example of changes in this situation.
There is a comment, but you might want to react to that, Andrey, from Anna Trush, and it is that she says that she was 12 when she came to the US. She's a Russian-speaking Ukrainian who has been visiting her mother, speaking hometown, who is Russian-speaking, hometown of Novaya Kakhovka every few years since I was in my mid-20s. I've taken my American-born kids to Ukraine on multiple occasions. You cannot even imagine the hatred that Russians have planted into Ukrainians. So I suppose thinking again about the kind of politics Havel personified and peace and non-war, how can we overcome hatred?
Well, I mean, hatred can be treated only over the years. I mean, hatred will remain because, I mean, for example, my mother-in-law, she hated Japanese for their atrocities against the British war prisoners until she died. So, I mean, the witnesses of this war will carry on this hatred, but this hatred will be against everything Russian, but hopefully not against completely Russian language, because, I mean, the Russian-speaking community in Ukraine is very big. It will diminish, it will become smaller, but now we are talking about between 30 and 40% of population. And because of the war, there are more people now who speak Russian. In Western Ukraine, where mostly predominantly Ukrainian was spoken, these are refugees. Many of them are learning Ukrainian now, but this war will have an impact on linguistic situation in Ukraine, of course. And still, I do hope that in some time we will have again more love stories among the books than war stories. I mean, at the moment, most of the new literature which is written and published is war literature. I mean, we can become a very militant society. And it's also responsibility of writers to harmonize the society after the war, to return tolerance, which was so typical for Ukraine, because Ukraine is multicultural and Ukrainians are used to have different, sometimes opposite opinions and still be friends, still be in touch, still be in discussion.
Yeah. Anna has just clarified here that you need to understand I'm not a witness. I've lived in the US for the last 30 years. I'm a very American Ukrainian, but I've learned everything about the Ukrainian culture here in the US, not when I lived in Ukraine.
I understand it. And I want to say that actually I met a Russian lady here in the US who helps Ukrainian community, who is collecting money for the humanitarian aid. She was not allowed to join one Ukrainian community because she is Russian, although she's American, but she is from Russia. Because, I mean, this is also a sign of intolerance and hatred on the basis of ethnicity or origin.
Yeah.
And we should, of course, I mean, we should judge people not by their origin, but by their behavior, by their attitude, by their political ideas.
Right. I have a question from Lisa Stone here. Mr. Kurkov, please tell us about how you first encountered Havel and his writings, and whether any form of them particularly stood out for you. Did you ever meet him in person? And could the Czech experience of resistance offer any example or hope for Ukraine?
Well, in 1968, the Russian invasion of Prague still in mind of many Ukrainians, and this is probably the most common thing that comes to mind to Ukrainians when they are talking about Havel and about Czech Republic. I never met Vaclav Havel. I read his essays, and at some point, I mean, his essays were very popular and very much discussed in Ukraine because Ukrainians were looking for some ways, future ways of Ukrainian society in his essays, and his plays were were staged in Ukraine. I'm not sure they are staged now; they are still running now, but. Definitely, I mean, they will come back because, I mean, this is the theater life when the plays are coming back onto the stage after 10 years break, 20 years break. But Prague is not only an image of the capital of the country for Ukrainians. I mean, Prague is the symbol of the fight for the freedom, fight for the independence. And Vaclav's name is part of this image. Vaclav's activities, his texts, his essays.
Yeah. And there's one final question, unless something else comes up. Thanking you for the conversation. And it's a very practical question, and I think you may have some advice for that. How can we, and this is from an anonymous attendee, but how can we help Ukrainian writers who are in Ukraine now?
Well, I mean, you can find a web page of Ukrainian Pen and send some money to Ukrainian Pen. I mean, we have program to help Ukrainian writers who are refugees abroad, who are even still remaining on the occupied territories. We are managing to send them money. We are helping Ukrainian writers in Ukraine who don't have means to live. So, I mean, this is one of the way to help. The other way to help is to buy and to read books by Ukrainian contemporary authors. They are translated now much more than before the war. And to buy and read books on Ukrainian history and Ukrainian culture. So these are the easiest way to help. But generally follow, I mean, you can follow Ukrainian writers on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. Today with Google Translate software, you can read whatever is written in Ukrainian language, in Russian language, on the Ukrainian websites and on Ukrainian Facebook pages.
There's another practical suggestion which we have made to, I've spoken at some campuses where people have asked me about writers in risk and all that. And the suggestion I usually make, at least in the US and the UK, is to write to your parliamentarian, write to your congressman or congresswoman, as the case may be, so that these writers, when they want to leave, find it easy to get visas. Now, I know Ukraine is a very special case and it's relatively easier for a Ukrainian writer to come out. But if it's an Afghan writer or a Sri Lankan, any other writer in distress, if you want to help, is to remove the barriers in that path that are created by bureaucracies because of the backlash against immigration. But that's just a broad general point that I thought I would make here.
Yeah, I agree, but I also want to mention that any Ukrainian writer traveling in Europe is perceived as a refugee.
Right.
And I travel a lot, and I was asked at the passport control very often whether I'm coming to ask for asylum, to ask for refuge, for help, or am I coming to take part in the conference? So in this sense, yes, Ukrainians are treated, I would say, positively usually, but yes. there is still some doubt from time to time.
Yeah. I think there are no further questions. So before ending, there were just two statements I often think of so that I don't feel too depressed about these kinds of conversations to look up. And I think it's the right way to end the conversation. First is, of course, Gandhi, who said once, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall." Think of it, always. That's an inspiring thought. And the other is from Havel, and which is about hope and optimism. You know, we were talking about, is it possible to hope or not? And this is what Havel had said in Disturbing the Peace. Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out.
I agree with both statements, and I just want to say that in the long term, evil never wins. The good prevails, the good returns to the territories destroyed by evil. And to recreate this good, very often you need works of artists. You need people to put bright paints on the gray color or dark color of the destruction. And Ukrainian artists and Ukrainian writers will do this. They are doing this already on the territories liberated from Russian occupants.
Thank you, and more power to you, and may peace return to Ukraine very, very soon, and so that you can go back to writing fiction.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the audience, to everybody who was listening to us and who will be listening to us, for your engagement, for your interest in this war, for your support, because your participation is your support for us, for Ukraine.
Andrey and Salil, I would like to thank you very much for this conversation that is so critical and topical and important for all of us to listen to. It gives us a more real idea of what people in Ukraine must be going through, which is still very difficult to feel on personal level. So it's a special privilege to have a Ukrainian person in conversation in this day. I also would like to thank you for the words of hope. I would like to thank everybody and also say my hope that the solidarity that has been shown in last 12 months in this fight for freedom, that the Ukrainians are really fighting for all of us. It's not just for Ukraine. We definitely feel it in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia. And so I also would like to say that I believe this solidarity is the force that moves us towards more just and free society. And I sincerely hope that in 1 year we could meet again and there will be no war anymore, and that we will celebrate the victory of Ukraine and its freedom and democracy. Thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much. Děkuji.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.